You know what it is? I love it.
I'd like to continue and really conclude my presentation, not your thoughts, but my reflections on this classic notion of guarding the mind and the heart, of managing, is the word that I used, of managing our thoughts and feelings. Yesterday in the discussion after the talk, one of the questions was rather brilliantly asked, or the observation is, I can't manage my thoughts. And I think we human beings think that we can't, but the saints did, and we're called to be saints. Blessed soon-to-be Saint John Paul II, he managed his thoughts and his feelings. Blessed Mother Teresa, Blessed Teresa of Calcutta, she managed her thoughts and her feelings. Now, note that they struggled with good and evil. I want to read a quotation from the event that took place within the Vatican Gardens after the election and inauguration of Pope Francis. There was a statue to St. Michael the Archangel that was dedicated, and it's one of the several and few public appearances that the two popes, the Pope and the Pope Emeritus, made together. It's for the blessing of the statue of St. Michael the Archangel. And in the brief discourse of that blessing, there was a sentence that I cut and pasted. The fight against evil is long and difficult. It is essential to pray constantly and to be patient. So what the early Christian monks talk about, guarding the mind and the heart, this is another form of that's more Western, is the idea of unceasing prayer, or I'm sure you've heard of the practice of the presence of God. But I love this. This sounds very much like a Jesuit. Pray constantly, but be patient. And again, I just want to underscore, and in these two talks about guarding the mind and the heart, and the fight of good and evil in our minds, our thoughts, and our feelings, and especially at the portal, at the beginnings of thoughts and feelings, or at the moment we recognize them, but we want to be careful not to think, not to be seduced by the predominant culture that would say, well, you can't control your thoughts or feelings. It's like you're just lying on the couch watching the TV show of your life pass by, and whatever happens, happens. The early monks are very, very careful to say that that you can totally control your thoughts and your feelings, but you have to be proactive. You have to decide. So that's why they would pray the Jesus prayer, or they prayed all 150 Psalms in one day. That was the beginning, and then you do it in a week. But what they did was, and this is before you had the printing press, they would memorize and recite passages of Scripture. And they had these mantras. One of their favorite ones was, O God, come to my assistance, O Lord, make haste to help me. So that gets stylized as the opening versicle and response of the Liturgy of the Hours. The Liturgy of the Hours grows out of this prayer form. Now, this is a little rabbit trail, but it's a worthwhile rabbit trail. within that formula of prayer, the actual Psalms were not the prayer. Because if you read the Desert Fathers, there would be a psalm, and then the monks would prostrate. So that means you lie down flat on the floor like you see in the Good Friday liturgy, or like you see during an ordination, or a final profession. So they would prostrate. And then there would be what's called the oratio. So there is this prayer of the heart, of the mind, in response to this word of God that's been proclaimed. Notice that it's proclaimed antiphonally, which means one side and then another side. Anti is opposite and phone is sound or voice. So one side is saying it, the other side is shutting up and listening, is receiving the word of God. Then this side of the choir proclaims it to the other. Now here, if you're with the monks, even when we're singing recto tono, which is Latin for on the same pitch, you have a pause in between the sides of choir, but even within each singing of a side of choir, there's an asterisk. So what did St. Benedict say in his rule that monks, when they stand to sing, that God is everywhere present, but especially when we gather to sing the divine office, the work of God, and monks must so sing so that their minds and hearts, that's what we're talking about, are in harmony with their voices. St. Augustine says, he who sings prays twice. The logic of the rule of St. Benedict is sometimes he or she who is singing isn't praying at all. It's not even a human act. So there's custody of the mind and the heart, even during the sacred liturgy. Now, Teresa of Avila, so all of the response to that question, how do you manage your thoughts when you're in meditation? So you can read her, but one of her vivid images is it's like you're in the water and a ship has gone over. You don't fight the thoughts that come to you. You incorporate them. So throughout the two millennia of Christian spirituality, people address this. And it's very important, I think, especially in our culture, that we have filters in terms of what we watch, what we listen to, what we read, because then it will control your thoughts. So, frankly, whenever, like every 3 or 4 days, there's some gunman in a grade school, or there's a gunman in a university, or there's a gunman in a shopping mall. And I think some of the response in our country is maudlin and unreflective and useless, because why would anyone be surprised that a 6th grader brings an automatic weapon and kills people? It is the constant content of our culture. So parents and grandparents take young souls. So if Vera, at the age of 5, knows what same-sex marriage is, it's her parents' fault. By parking a soul and letting the soul be formed by the content of, an 8-year-old, how many violent deaths have been etched across their brain by the time they're 8 in the normal U.S. culture? So at any rate, that is something that is a great evil. Now, yesterday I mentioned this whole question of fight or flight. The church is in open fight against the evil in the world. And just last night, in the Holy Father's apostolic exhortation, there was a sentence that struck me, is that we have a moral obligation to be politically involved. So we must fight the evil in our culture. But let me move on here. I want to read something that Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote, a Russian writer who was imprisoned in Siberia for many years, and then was released and took asylum in the West, and then rather openly criticized the West. And by citing him, I haven't followed all of his opinions and what he's done, but this is one paragraph he wrote that I think is quite fine. It was granted to me to carry away from my prison years, this would have been decades in Siberia, from my prison years on my bent back, which nearly broke beneath its load, that was hard labor, this essential experience. How a human being becomes evil and how good. So this was kind of like an early Egyptian desert, this imprisonment in Siberia. In the intoxication of youthful successes, I had felt myself to be infallible. And I was therefore cruel. So when he's in Siberia, he's realizing, well, when I was young, I had it all together and I was cruel. In the surfeit of power, I was a murderer and an oppressor. In my most evil moments, I was convinced that I was doing good, and I was well supplied with systematic arguments. It was only when I lay there on rotting prison straw that I sensed within myself the first stirrings of good. Gradually, it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart. And this man would never have ever read Francis de Sales. I don't think it would be possible in the Soviet Union in his years. And through all human hearts. This line shifts. Inside us, it oscillates with the years. Even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained. And even in the best of all hearts, there remains a small corner of evil. Now, classic people like Pope Francis and Pope Benedict XVI and Pope John Paul II, and especially Pope John Paul II, who lived through the enormous systematic state evil and watched it, he would say, yes, even in these hearts overwhelmed by evil, there's one small bridgehead of good, and that's where you got to that's where you have to evangelize. Also, please note that our present Holy Father, and I might have said it yesterday, it's in Facebook Vatican Radio English section. If you follow that page, they provide official English translations of the Pope's morning homilies. And frequently, he talks about community life, which would be monasteries, but also ministry houses. And as I said, frequently is mentioning the devil, but he has this little vice list that's kind of like St. Paul. He's talking about within communities gossip and rivalry and calumny and careerism. And he frequently says the same thing. We have to rid this out of our Christian communities. There's something that's I think very significant there. We don't want to let anything in the scriptures go to waste, and we don't want to have the world events go to waste. And this afternoon I want to propose for our reflection some texts and some figures that apply to our theme. We have very real power. We have moral authority over our own hearts and minds, and from our hearts and minds, our words and actions. We have power as individuals, as members of households, communities, and ministries. So we want, I think, to think of ourselves as kings and queens with advisors. Matthew chapter 2. When Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of King Herod, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star at its rising and have come to do him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was greatly troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Let me just comment on Magi from the east. What are Magi in the context of this story? Is they're Gentiles, they're pagans, they're not of the chosen people of God. And I think this is a very common theme. This ties in with the theme of the Holy Father, that when we engage in listening and evangelizing, we must recognize that our audiences have some truth in themselves and some dignity, and respect that, and then we can really engage in a communication. So I think this is very interesting, the fact that here are these Magi coming to the king of Israel, of Judea, and informing that anointed of God and all these chief priests that, by the way, the king of the Jews has just been born. But notice they're troubled. And the point I'm going to make is Herod our middle name? Assembling all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. So the chief priests, these are the religious authorities, intelligentsia. They said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it has been written through the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, since from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Now, I think that, again, we have a resonance here in Matthew's gospel, which is not the Lucan gospel of the poor, but it very much strikes me, this emphasis, and it's a very interesting mark of providence, that Jesus is born in the least. Remember in Matthew's judgment scene in Matthew 25, whatever you did or didn't do to the least. Then Herod sends the Magi secretly to ascertain the time of the star's appearance. One of the things that just strikes me too is that you have natural law, you have philosophy, you have natural theology, you have this, in this story, you have this star pointing out Jesus. So I think we must always be careful as evangelizers and ministers. We must be careful to respect the various unlikely sources where people come to the truth and grace that is Jesus Christ, and to not denigrate that in our minds. Sometimes these people are called astrologers, these ancient astrologers. They were overjoyed at seeing the star after the audience with the king, and the star that they had seen came, and the star brought them to Jesus. There are physicists, there are people in the medical profession, there are people in all sorts of walks of life that they come to Jesus very indirectly from these other experience of life and these other disciplines. And on entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they prostrated themselves and did him homage. Then, of course, they offered their gifts. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed for their own country to another way. Then, it's very important for our theme, is that when they had departed, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise, take the child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there till I tell you." Yesterday, at the end of our session, I read through a number of New Testament texts about having this mental sobriety and self-possession and being very vigilant and being very much on the guard. Now, there was also the notion of fight the good fight and resist the devil. So, sometimes you stay and fight. Here the angel says, "Rise, take the child and his mother, protect them." So frequently in our life and in our ministry, we have to know when to hold them and when to fold them, when to fight and when to just get away. One of the things that struck me recently is something I say from time to time in homilies, and I thought, I don't think growing up I heard it otherwise from my parents, and I don't think I've really heard it in public discourse, in homilies. And I thought it needs to be said, is that over and over again, my parents would say to me, there are so many times in life when you must simply leave. You must turn and walk the other way in the face of temptation. Now, this is starting with the little child saying, there are things worse than death, like mortal sin. The child gets your attention. It's like, mortal sin is worse than death. But I can remember a classic, there's an epic movie called Dr. Zhivago. It's a story written by Boris Pasternak, who's a Russian poet and writer who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, I believe. And it takes place in the years of the Russian Revolution, and it's an epic, very extravagant film, very, very beautiful. Omar Sharif starred, and the very beautiful actress Julie Christie, and this was back when you had to go to theaters, and I was probably in the 5th grade, and my mother took me. And I think halfway through the film, she realized I might have been a little young for the film. This is long before there were these ratings. so I remember very vividly on the way home, adultery is adultery is adultery, and doesn't matter if there's beautiful scenery. It's wrong and will never make anyone happy. And the male protagonist had been in an arranged marriage, and his wife was very good, and he falls in love, but there was the classic line, so often in life you must simply immediately turn and walk the other way. And yes.
I have a question about the Dr. Zhivago moment, relating it to something you said earlier about Vera finding out about gay marriage.
Yes.
Right? So it strikes me that when you are talking about managing your thoughts, that's something different than choosing your thoughts. That like thoughts may arrive that you need to manage.
Right, but you manage your thoughts by managing the content of your personal or household culture beforehand. See, the early Desert Fathers, if they had inappropriate dreams, it would be because of their past sins. And so then they figure, well, how do I get rid of these thoughts? Or they would have been engaged in inappropriate conversation. Or they just never went to town.
But there's like an external and internal management.
Right, there's an external and internal management, and so there's certain forms of entertainment you don't. Now, St. John Chrysostom was against the theater totally and would preach very graphically about it. And then he would say, you say it's harmless, that this is fiction. So he even went so far as he would start telling this story, and he says, look at you, you're in church, and I'm your bishop, and you're aroused by this, what I'm saying, and you're trying to tell me that when you go to the theater, it doesn't bother you morally. He said, like, this is false. It's like he just considered those theatrical productions as being very dangerous for his flock morally. So, with the Vera idea, a young parent would not use the television as a babysitter and say, okay, Hollywood, I want you and President Obama to form my child, mind and soul.
Vera's situation is going to be really complicated here in a second. That's my follow-up. But what did you mean by St. Teresa of Avila seeing a ship go overhead like you're underwater? What did that mean?
I think what she says is you just, you're there and it's just going over. It's just let it go by. You acknowledge it and it just, it goes.
All right, so various parents have had more freedom than some parents have. Some parents don't have this freedom to choose where they want to live, right?
Yes.
And also, but Vera at her age has been to flop houses, has seen alcoholics, she's seen deadbeat parents, she has seen, transsexuals, walking around the neighborhood and things like this, right? So she's being exposed to quite a bit if the whole goal is to manage.
Right, but she probably doesn't know a transsexual is a transsexual unless it's the storyline of some comedy or something.
Sure. I guess my question is, I am kind of like, I chose this, and I'm okay with this, and I even like this for Vera, with the idea that we are just interpreting with her all the time.
Constantly, that's like my mother did with Dr. Zhivago. It became a teaching moment.
Yeah, like if we see our neighbors fighting in the streets, we have to talk to her.
That I'll never forget for the rest of my life, that simple thing. But I do think, and it was Ryan's question, like, well, you can't manage. You see, morally, we have to have a plan and we have a plan and we pray, plus we have other people managing. At the end, I'm going to pray to St. Michael the Archangel, the classic prayer. So we have the Blessed Mother as the portress of our thoughts. So we have a game plan that when we're in a position of temptation, and remember your game plan is for your mind and your heart, you're an alcoholic, you're not going to go meet with someone in a bar. You'll go to a Starbucks instead. So that there's this macro management of our mind and heart. But I really like what you've brought up, is that I personally very much agree with you that it's in the context of very aggressively loving parents that will fight to the death for the soul of their child. That it's those parents that introduce them to what the evils of the world are. That they don't have some peer, that they don't learn that. It just occurred to me when I was a little boy, probably 6 years old, 7 years old, Skid Row in Chicago. Saw it every once right before Christmas. We'd go to the very poor neighborhoods. And my father, my father, when he was young, before he was married, was something of a Clark Massey. He was in Chicago doing street evangelization, and it was all run by a priest of the Archdiocese of Chicago, and he was a prefect in a dormitory for troubled boys. And so I can still remember just being amazed, these drunk men on the streets in Skid Row. And my father would tell stories of real people, of what their lives was like, what their lives were like, and then what happened. And generally there'd be a moral story, and then this is how they ended up. Just this good, evil, and the consequences of evil. And something else, I can remember being 6 years old. My father was in management in Catholic institutions, but I would frequently go with him, and sometimes we would be in restaurants eating. And we was sitting there as a little boy and had a coat and tie on and everything. And all of a sudden there was this harsh voice in my ear that was very common growing up. Not mean, but parental. I think my head must have gotten turned by the world. Because he just, immediately this voice said, none of this is real. He said, you will never get a finer meal than at your own mother's table. He said, look around this room. This is not real. What you have at home, that's real human life. This is not wrong, but it's not real. So I think my head had gotten turned by the glitter and fanciness of the world, because it was a very nice restaurant and all of that. So rise, take the child and his mother. So frequently in our own lives, Christ and the Blessed Mother will be present in the form of some new grace, some new movement in our prayer life. And it's very, very common that there's a Herod and all Jerusalem that's ready to stamp that out. So sometimes you have to rise, take the child and the mother away. There's been a new Christmas in your life. And Mary and Jesus are present there, and you have to be your own Saint Joseph. So you get out of there. Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him. Joseph rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt. He stayed there until the death of Herod, that what the Lord had said through the prophet might be fulfilled. Out of Egypt I called my son. So you have a brand new grace operative in your life, and a temptation comes that will just kill it and you, and so you just flee. When Herod realized that he'd been deceived by the Magi, he became furious and ordered the massacre of all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity 2 years old and under, in accord with the time he had ascertained from the Magi. This is what was fulfilled, what had been said through Jeremiah the prophet. A voice was heard in Ramah, sobbing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children, and she would not be consoled, since they were no more. Of course, I'm going to talk about R.V. Wade in just a moment, but there's something that has struck me as a priest is I feel I have always, in the decades of my priesthood, been bungling and inept ministering to women who have had abortions. So I think of and of course there's this wonderful ministry for women with abortions in the church. So I just comment that I think as we must always be ready and prepared to and I think reverently feel inept and bungling. The reason why I say this is there's a Mother Teresa quotation where at a national prayer breakfast, this little hydrogen bomb is standing there on the same platform with Bill and Hillary Clinton, who's still president of the United States. So she's there and she chooses the moment with them on the stage to say that any society in which a mother can kill her own child in no way can tell anybody else that they don't have the right to kill somebody. You know, that this was not in the script. The president and his wife didn't know that this wonderful Mother Teresa was going to choose. She's only just as tall as the podium she's speaking from. So it's like she stole the day. But I really think it's very, very important to recognize, and I believe this is in the Pope's apostolic exhortation, speaking about moral hierarchies and how there are hierarchies of truth. That goes back to St. Thomas Aquinas, and in morality there are moral hierarchies, and the exhortation, if I remember correctly, it talks about something that's in the Catechism about how you can have an intrinsic objective evil, but you subjectively, the moral culpability is conditioned by other factors of coercion. But there was also this phrase that referred to, it didn't say societal brainwashing, but it had just the impact of someone's moral knowledge. But I'm always gripped. My bowels are moved, as New Testament would say, moved to compassion, just like Jesus, about Rachel not being consoled. So while we must desperately fight abortion. We must console the women who are victims of this own of moral horror. Okay, when are we Herod? And of what and of whom are we afraid? When are we the authors of Roe v. Wade? Of course, I'm speaking metaphorically. Human beings seek comfort and control. If you have comfort and control in your life, then you build an altar to the status quo. You also build a temple, you build a fortress to it. So, if any magi come in and speak of any threat to it, well, you're going to be Herod and all Jerusalem, and you want to squash it out. So, Roe v. Wade is part of something that is larger. Human societal life is meant to be multi-generational. However, in our consumptive culture, many live without the annoyance and the expense of children. And as Paul VI predicted, with artificial contraception, he would divorce sexual activity from any responsibility. So look at the culture in the West. It's not a culture of life. It's a culture that's anti-children and babies, because with you, they're very expensive and they're very annoying, and your comfort and your control go out the window. So we cannot ever forget the horror and scourge of abortion in our country and in Western culture. Our suburbs are full of sometimes gargantuan houses, often without any children. In our country, often Rachel seems not to be weeping, but remember, the wages of sin is death, and you get the paycheck right away. At the same time, households that were once multi-generational, they are now without the elderly's prophecy of diminishment and mortality. It's good for us to have older people that are diminished and that remind us of our own mortality. That's the greatest prophecy. Now, I said yesterday that Pope Francis has made Clark Massey a has-been, has taken all of his talking points. This sentence I wrote before Pope Francis came along, who also has this big theme of the role of the elderly. And at World Youth Day was talking about the elderly. So this same society that will throw away and kill babies will also want to kill, oftentimes literally the old, but to send them to kind of like an Auschwitz ahead of time before the final liquidation. Remember, the households were once multi-generational, and the Holy Father, Pope Francis, said in the World Youth Day context somewhere that, you know, the young people need the old people, and the old people need the young people. And there are studies that young parents with children need old people. That a lot of some of the problems that we find in our society, it used to be taken care of in multi-generational neighborhoods, because the young mothers would get told by the old women, it's like, you go lie down or something. a large number of people in our country live in a relative luxury compared with the rest of the globe, and there are no infants or elderly around to threaten that luxury. So the spirit of Herod and the slaughter of the innocents is very much alive and well in our culture. But I want to just point out, not just with abortion. Monasteries, I think, are countercultural in that they remain very multi-generational, everyone living under one roof. So I do think that Christian communities ought to be the same way. And I know I have gone and preached in evangelical churches, some mega churches where there was no gray hair. They're all young, scrubbed people, but they would have babies. They would have children, but they wouldn't have any elderly. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander, so maybe Simple House needs some elderly volunteers. Of course, you have elderly people you minister to, so that was just ad lib. That it could have been a demon that made me say that, or it could have been the Holy Spirit. Once in our monastery here, there was a very intense discussion about the restoration of the basilica that happened. It was finished in 1999 with the murals of, and we restored it wasn't restored, it was the marble, new marble from the gorgeous altar was made. But an abbot, not the current abbot, a previous abbot, enraged everyone when he said, well, brothers, we have to understand the fact that 40 years from now, another generation of monks of Conception Abbey is going to undo what we've done. And people said, but this is the basilica, they can't undo it. Because you see, we, of course, are right and illumined, and we know what we're doing. There's the spirit of Herod. It's like, here are these people, Herod and all Jerusalem are greatly troubled that there's a baby born that's going to have power. So, sometimes in the church, you hear older people say, well, the young people these days, they don't know about such and such and such. Or you hear people say, the bishops being appointed nowadays don't seem to realize. These statements were made in the church 40 years ago, 80 years ago, 120 years ago. Statements will be made like that 40 years from now and 80 years from now, but they're the spirit of Herod. So we have to be very, very careful that we're not like Herod and that we're not using the standard operating procedure of Roe v. Wade is to at all costs maintain our control and our comfort, and to maintain the status quo of power. How do we handle the newborn Christ as he presents himself to us? Christ is newborn in our world and lives in our world and our lives and our church over and over again. One may have a pope that is Bishop of Rome, Vicar of Christ on earth, you dearly love him, and then he resigns and someone else is elected. Are you Herod and want to slaughter the new pope? Or a new pastor? Or a new whatever. We want to be very careful that we're not in our throne room with our advisors frequently, that if you're King Herod, they're going to be telling you what you want to hear, and very much propping up your notion of power. there are striking alternatives to Herod. Think of the visitation scene right after the incarnation. Is that the very young Mary goes to visit the elderly Elizabeth to support her in her vocation and what God is doing in her life. Tomorrow, or Sunday, either one, I'm not sure which, I'll mention the scene of Sunday's feast of the presentation of the Lord, where Simeon, unlike Herod, says, okay, God, dismiss me. I'm out of here. My work's done. Go ahead. I'm done. Is the art of closure. Can we let go and move? Letgo.com, moveon.org. It's a huge thing in human life. You know, the classic newborn Christ is if you're in your family of origin and a new sibling is born. How do you handle that? So that's you're a volunteer, and then suddenly there are 2 more volunteers walk in the door, and their presence changes everything from the way things were done. You know, for the last 2 years, and now there's somebody else that's setting the table differently. There's the spirit of Herod and Roe versus Wade. It can be alive and well in that moment. It's important for us to be engaged and present and active in our lives, our community, and our church and our world, but we have to wear the mantle of our ministry very loosely. You know, you can wear clothes tightly or you can wear them loosely. So we have to recognize the power and the responsibility we have to make due a point, to function, to change the world. Oftentimes we find we can't micromanage the present. So let's stop trying to micromanage the future. And that's what Herod did by killing all those little baby boys. Was thinking he could control the future. Now please note as you read on in Matthew that an angel an angel informs Joseph that Herod is dead. So he goes back, but he gets another dream that there is a successor to Herod. So he doesn't go back to Judea, he goes north to Nazareth. And for your own reflection, keep reading in Matthew's Gospel, and you'll read Jesus got the you-know-what out of Nazareth. Doesn't really say why. Oh, yes, it does. I'm sorry. It's when he heard that John had been arrested by still another Herod, a third Herod. There are always Herods. And sometimes we are our own Herods. There are always Herods. He withdrew to Galilee of the Gentiles. And Matthew will cite, Isaiah, land of Zebulun, land of Naphtali, the road to the sea. So he went and lived by Capernaum by the sea. So Jesus also, it doesn't explicitly say, but Jesus knew about fight and flight. So when he heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew to Galilee. So just keep reading on in Matthew's gospel. I want to just give you some other citations. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 17b. Just a little phrase. You can read it in context. Be separate. And you can read the context, like separate yourselves from them. So this might be canceling your cable subscription, or 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 4c. Having escaped the corruption in the world that is in the world through lust. The Douay Rheims is flying the corruption of that concupiscence which is in the world. So it's that epithumia that we mentioned. This, and for St. Thomas, this concupiscence is a result of original sin. So we're fleeing the corruption that's in the world because of our disordered passions. Okay, Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 6. Flee out of the midst of Babylon. Everyone save his own life or his own soul in the Vulgate. Be not cut off in her iniquity. It is the time of the Lord's vengeance. He will render unto her recompense. So this is the famous flee from the midst of Babylon. Get out while you can. Now, the prophet Isaiah also will use the same image, like flee Babylon. Please note that in the prophet Jeremiah, there is a letter to the exiles in Babylon that says, okay, you're here, you must work for the good of the city in which you live, because its good is your good. So this is the counterpart. There, sometimes you stay and you try to transform the culture, try to transform the ethos of the group. You participate, but at other times you must simply flee. I have one more point that I want to make regarding the Herod story, is that we note that the angel tells Joseph, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt. And then notice that after Herod is dead, there is a second flight where he goes to Nazareth. And then thirdly, Jesus himself will leave Nazareth, having heard that John was arrested by this Herod. The point that I want to make is, if the Holy Family itself, Jesus and Mary and Joseph, sometimes are fleeing, how much all the more should we?